started. Thank you all for filling in the poll. We will share those results at the end. Well, I have the pleasure of introducing our host today. Dr. Mitzi Krockover is board president of the Institute for Mental Health Research. An internist, she is the former founding director of the Iris Cantor UCLA Women's Health Center for former vice president of women's health at Humana. Her interest in femtech led her to Golden Seeds, an angel investment organization funding dynamic companies led by outstanding women. She's a managing director and co-chair of the Health Sector Group and a founding member of the Arizona chapter of Golden Seeds. Thank you so much, Mitzi. Welcome.
Thank you, Kelly. And on behalf of the Institute for Mental Health Research, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to today's webinar. I know that you will find it interesting and useful as we all try to navigate this challenging time. As you heard, I'm Mitzi Krockover, the board president of IMHR. And before we get to our featured speaker, I'd like to tell you a little bit about IMHR and our work. We know that mental health challenges are felt all around us. If you don't have a personal mental health challenge, then I'm sure you know someone who has struggled. The pandemic has highlighted this fact all too well and exacerbated it. Stress, anxiety, and isolation have become widespread, and those with pre-existing challenges have experienced even more impact. And we know that physical health is greatly affected by our mental health status. Poor psychological health is detrimental to our immune system and can exacerbate physical ailments such as cancer, diabetes, and heart disease. Yet, in spite of the significant impact of mental health on our minds, bodies, and communities, funding for mental health research is severely limited. For example, in 2016, the NIH budget was $31 billion, yet the National Institutes for Mental Health received only $1.6 billion. One expert lamented that with the lack of funding, we are at, quote, a risk of losing an entire generation of mental health research scientists. That's where we come in. We provide seed funding for early stage mental health research that is being conducted right here in Arizona. We promote the translation of that research into direct use through educational programs such as today's webinar and conferences for both professionals and the lay public. We've chosen this path for two reasons: to help mental health research progress so that we find innovative, evidence-based solutions that help alleviate the challenges of mental illness and promote mental health well-being, and to support our Arizona scientists so that they can do the early work to enable them to apply for larger grants from institutions and foundations like the NIH, the Department of Defense, and others, which then propels their work even further. This also brings funds to their institutions and to the Arizona economy, and it helps to keep these scientists in the state so that they can continue their good work. So just to reiterate, the process of obtaining a large grant to make significant progress on an area of research starts with that scientist's first hypothesis about what might happen given an intervention. That scientist needs early stage funding to do a small study to prove that hypothesis. That's where IMHR provides our funding. And if the scientist is successful, he or she or they will be able to more successfully apply for larger grant funding. When we make a grant, we, with the help of our Scientific Advisory Council, look for the kinds of factors that make for more successful applications for those larger funds. Small study with successful outcomes, a creative or innovative idea with great potential to answer critical questions, and clear scientific or public health significance. We have funded over 37 scientists from 16 Arizona institutions, we're institution agnostic, for over $2 million. These promising scientists have gone on to receive $20 million in larger grants and funding, underlining the importance of supporting early research that might not have gone further without it. We like to say small investment, big returns. And as an investor, that's music to anyone's ears. By doing so, we have furthered mental health research, supported our scientists, and through them, brought more dollars into the Arizona economy and to our institutions. Changing gears a bit, It's said that the mental health implications of the pandemic is a, quote, coming tsunami that will last longer than the physical impacts of the virus itself. So in order to respond quickly to this challenge, we have launched the COVID-19 Mental Health Research Impact Fund to devote grants to researchers studying the impact of and response to COVID-19. Some research, as you will hear today, has been ongoing and easily relatable to the current crisis, while others will be new research looking at issues such as the impact of the crisis on first responders, health workers, and essential workers, the impact of social isolation, especially as it affects our elderly and our children, exacerbation of pre-existing mental illness, and the direct effects of COVID-19 on the nervous system, which we're only beginning to understand. So you're going to hear more about the research during today's discussion, as well as how you might be involved. I'd like to announce, this is our first announcement, that IMHR has already awarded 2 grants from the fund just this month. The grants were awarded to Dr. Athena Aktipis and Dr. Michelle or Lonnie Chioda. And you're obviously going to be hearing from Dr. Aktipis later today, or in just a moment actually. Her grant goes to support her work at ASU in cooperation, interdependence, and psychological well-being during the COVID-19 pandemic. Our other 2020 grant recipient, Michelle Lonnie Chioda, also from ASU, is known for her innovative studies on emotion. She's currently investigating the implications of human emotion in coping with COVID. She will provide insight on her research during a second webinar hosted by IMHR in October, on October the 16th, and we hope you will join us then. We will also hear from Dr. Felipe Castro in November at our third webinar about his work with resilience during stressful times and how we can apply what he's learned to our current time. And he is a previous IMHR grantee. So on behalf of our board, Dr. Keith Cernick, Michael Meyer, Lauren Meyer, Dr. Jeanette Smith, and myself, again, we want to welcome and thank you for being here. I'll now turn the next part of our presentation over to Dr. Keith Cernick. Dr. Cernick is IMHR's Chief Science Officer, overseeing our Scientific Advisory Council and serves on our Board of Directors. Dr. Cernick is the recently retired Foundation Professor and Chair of the Department of Psychology at ASU. With more than 130 publications and nearly 12,000 citations, his important work focuses on child development and the parent-child interaction. Keith, I'm going to turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mitzi. Welcome, everybody. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Athena Aktipis, our presenter today. Dr. Aktipis is an eminent evolutionary biopsychologist, right, who weaves biological, evolutionary, and psychological constructs in innovative and transdisciplinary ways to create new pathways to understanding human behavior and disease processes. Dr. Aktipis has an impressive academic pedigree, as you might expect, right? She did her undergraduate work at Reed College up in Portland, Oregon, got her doctoral degree at the University of Pennsylvania back in Philadelphia. She then came west doing her postdoc work at the University of Arizona, which as an ASU person I'll forgive, right? But also, and that work was really centered on topics of ecology and evolutionary biology. And after doing her postdoc work, she headed to California to work at UCSF and co-founded the Center for Evolution and Cancer. While she was a research scientist at UCSF, she also then spent a year at the Institute for Advanced Study in Berlin, a very impressive place to spend some time, honing her ideas about cancer and evolutionary susceptibility. In 2014, ASU was lucky enough to entice her to a faculty position in psychology, where she is currently an associate professor and the co-director of the Human Generosity Project. And not only that, she's a highly valued collaborator across multiple institutes and centers at ASU and nationally and internationally. Her research centers on topics of cooperation and conflict across both biological and psychological systems. She's recently turned her attention to COVID-19 to understand how human cooperation has been affected by this pandemic and how to better understand the consequences of that effect. Cooperation is endemic to both community and individual well-being, so understanding the way it operates during this time is critical to multiple health concerns, as we will see. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Athina Aktipis, who will present Cooperation in the Time of COVID, Implications for Mental Health. Athina?
Thank you so much, Keith. And I just want to say that it is such a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate you inviting me to be a part of this webinar, and also for generously funding our work. I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing, actually looking at changes in cooperation and interdependence and some other behaviors during the time of COVID over the last 5-6 months. But before I do that, I'm going to give a little bit of background into some of the deeper questions we have about human cooperation, and how important that cooperation, that feeling of having a safety net, can be for our well-being in general. And something that we've had the opportunity to look at with lots of different methods. I'm really excited to share that with you. So really, my motivating question, and the motivating question for the Human Generosity Project in general, is really understanding how humans behave, especially in times of crisis, and especially with regard to cooperating with others. We're interested in the psychological elements of that, in terms of how people are feeling, what they believe about the world, what the nature is of the crises that they're in, and how those things all influence people's cooperation. Now, the very big picture on this is that crises are part of sort of the human experience. There's something that we have faced as humans for our entire evolutionary history, whether it was famines or droughts or wartime. These are fundamentally, having crises is something that humans have faced. And so we would expect that different societies around the world would have sort of ways of dealing with those that are both sort of cultural and psychological, and also that evolutionarily, we would have psychological mechanisms that evolved to be there to help us to deal with challenges. And some of those involve having this sort of social safety net. So we've seen in our work that people help each other in times of need across societies. And this has, many different aspects to it, why people do it. And we'll get into some of that as I shared with you a little bit more about our project. So this is the Human Generosity Project. We have sites around the world where we are looking at these systems that essentially provide these social safety nets. So I'll talk a little bit about Osotwa, which is a system the Maasai use, helping each other in times of need. In Fiji, they have a system called Keri Keri, which is similar. Many hunter-gatherer societies use what's called central place food sharing, where they bring extra food that they foraged and share it with the people who are most in need. Neighboring is something that is a US phenomenon, and we've studied some ranchers in the desert Southwest, not so far from where we are here, who have these practices of neighboring that help them to deal with challenges that they face. And then finally, I'm going to talk about a really exciting project with the Ik people in Uganda, where we've found that they actually have a tremendous amount of cooperation and sharing, despite having a bad reputation in anthropology because of early work that was done. So if you'll excuse me, I have this sharing polls up. I need to get rid of it so I can see my slides. Okay, there we go. So now my slides are not advancing after that. Okay, I'm having a technical problem here. The poll came up and now I can't actually advance my slides.
Can you maybe stop sharing your screen and then try it again.
Yeah, I'm trying to stop sharing screen, but it won't. Oh,
Oh, there we go.
Now things are moving. Okay, great. Sorry about that, everybody. Here we are now looking at need-based transfers. So all of these systems of helping are characterized by need-based sharing. And so essentially what happens is somebody makes a request because they don't have enough resources for themselves or for their families. So they might not have enough food to eat, for example. And then they ask somebody for help, and that other person then gives them what they need, as long as it does not put that giver below their own threshold for what they need. So this is essentially, it's a limited risk pooling system where individuals have these relationships where they help each other, but it doesn't put them at risk of going below what they need. So it's different from a resource pooling system, where in a resource pooling system, you would have everybody put everything in, right, and then distribute it. It's not that. You still have private property. Individuals have their own resources, but they have these special relationships that they can depend on in times of need. So with the Human Generosity Project, we've looked at these need-based transfer systems across many small-scale societies. We've also done empirical work in the lab to understand how and why people engage in these need-based transfers. And we've also done a lot of computational simulations to look at how evolutionarily viable these strategies are. Our goals also include communicating with the public and exploring broader implications. And now we're focusing quite a lot of our work actually on understanding how these topics interact with crises like the current pandemic, and looking at things that might be sort of unique to the challenges that are happening in the pandemic, where we can use insights from our work to maybe even help with discovering ways of mitigating some of those costs that are that many people in society are feeling because of the current situation. So if we look at this from the sort of perspective, long-term evolutionary perspective, managing risk in the form of these kinds of safety nets are one of the benefits of being social, because if you're not social, you can't rely on others. So, organisms, species that aren't social, that don't interact with one another, they don't even have the chance to, be there for one another in times of need. For us as humans, we have that ability. And one of the societies that I think is a great example of this, and it's actually where the Human Generosity Project started, is the Maasai of East Africa. They have a lifestyle where they are herding in an ecological environment that has a lot of variability. So they're in the Great Rift Valley, where sometimes it's a wet season, sometimes it's a dry season, depending on the elevation of where they are. The conditions could be very different. And then they have these relationships with others called osotois relationships, often with people who are not in the exact same ecology as them, that can help provide some resilience. So essentially for them, what happens is they're, growing their herds, and they're then living off of their herds. But the growth of their herds will vary. And sometimes there will be negative events like drought and disease, or even theft, that make them lose some of their cattle and then can make it hard for them to support themselves and their families. So the solution that the Maasai have for this is this cultural idea of osotois. It's very much embedded in their way of life. And the two main sort of rules in osotois are that you ask only if you're in genuine need, and you give if you're asked and able. And interestingly, osotois is also the word for umbilical cord in the Maasai language, ma. And so this is really this sort of metaphor of one individual giving to another individual that's in need, in a very sort of embodied kind of way. And what is unique about osotois in relation to the way that people have often thought about these resource transfer systems is that there is no expectation of payback. So there's a relationship that the individuals know they can depend on in times of need, but there isn't a tracking of accounts. And we know this not just because they have the Masai that we've talked to have explained this in depth, but also because they have a different system that has to do with account keeping. They call that Sile. And this is a system where they might ask for a loan and then pay it back. And that the fact that they differentiate these two systems makes it really clear that the Oso-Twa system is really about something that is not account keeping. It's about really sort of being that safety net for one another. So I created a model to look at the viability of this Oso-Twa rule, where individuals in the model had herds and they could experience these crises and ask for help. And this let me look at how these different strategies would perform in the simulated ecology. And essentially what I found was that the Oso-Twa rule did a lot better than probabilistic rules that had the same likelihood of asking, the same amounts of asking and giving, but not in the conditional way that Oso-Twa did. So if you remember, Oso-Twa is ask only if in need, give if you're asked and able. Following those rules gives much higher herd survival. Now, there's also a question of, well, what happens if you have a Oso-Twa or need-based system, but playing with individuals who are using a debt-based approach? So I was able to then create a modification of this model that would allow me to look at debt-based players as well. And what I found was that need-based players, two players that are both using need-based strategy, they do better than no transfers, and they do better than two players that are playing a debt-based strategy. But what's interesting is that if you have a need-based and a debt-based player playing with each other, then you get lower payoffs than two individuals playing need-based together. But it's actually what's called a stag hunt in game theory, which means that if you start with both people playing debt-based, you can't actually get to the need-based place without the parties taking a risk by changing their strategy. So you have to coordinate in order to be able to get there effectively. So I think this potentially has some important implications for, how do we, if we want to shift norms about how we build safety nets and interact with each other when people are in need, there may be some important factors here that have to do with cultural change and coordinating that. Okay, so how about when things get worse? Like, how does crisis relate to these need-based and debt-based strategies and their success? Well, essentially what we find is that in situations where things are really good, everybody survives in these models, basically. In situations when the volatility rate and volatility size is really high, no agents survive. And so you really only see this benefit from the need-based transfer strategy in these times of crisis that are intense, but not so intense that there are no survivors. So to us, this is really interesting in that, sometimes when things are too good, it actually can hide what the benefits are of having these social safety nets. Now, need-based transfers are not unique to humans. So Keith had mentioned that my work actually spans lots of different levels of analysis. I just want to point out that it's not just humans, but also vampire bats. They share blood with the most hungry bats, that the hunger of the recipient is the best predictor of bats helping each other. And it's also something that's very common in social insects. So for example, ants have this practice called trophallaxis, where an ant that is hungry will come up and tap the antennae of an ant that has recently foraged, and that ant that has recently foraged will then regurgitate food for that ant who is hungry. So these all map on to the need-based transfer kind of logic. And in fact, need-based transfers are part of how multicellularity itself works. So when cells first started aggregating together, they created a mass where the inside couldn't get resources just through diffusion. And so there had to be some mechanism for transport of resource from the cells that had access to it to the ones that didn't. So this is actually a fundamental component of how multicellularity works. Now, that kind of brings up some questions. Well, how are these need-based systems evolutionarily viable, right? If you have just individuals giving to others based on need, how does that maintain itself evolutionarily? Well, traditionally, a lot of the work in evolution of cooperation has focused on explanations like genetic relatedness. So, well, I cooperate with my offspring because they share my genes, and because they share my genes, they're also then likely to have the genes that code for helping kin. So there's that explanation. And there's also this account keeping explanation. So those two explanations have been really dominant in the work that's happened on the evolution of cooperation over the last 50, 60, 70 years. But there's another approach that actually is inclusive both of the genetic relatedness and reciprocity explanations, but includes also other possibilities, which is fitness interdependence. So this is the degree to which two or more organisms are positively or negatively influencing each other's success. And so this is a way of actually capturing many, many different components that can go into making cooperation viable. Fitness interdependence is an important part of many human relationships. Relationships like osotoi, familial relationships, even relationships among individuals who are in times of crisis like war, can be very dependent on each other for survival and for their reproductive success. In disasters, interdependence is very high often because there's such critical situations where having that help could make a very big difference. Now, one of the things that we've done is actually created a scale to measure people's perceptions of their interdependence with others. And this is one of the measures that we've used in this work that we've done with COVID. And the idea is essentially you can be, fully aligned with someone, like say we're both in that top car of the Ferris wheel, number 12. Anything that's good for me is good for you. Or we could have interests that are conflicting, like the individuals in the red cars. And then you have lots of other possibilities as well. So one of the things that we found was that perceived fitness interdependence was a very strong predictor of willingness to help, and stronger than genetic relatedness as a predictor of willingness to help. Now, our interdependence is, I think, a really fundamental characteristic just of what it means to be human, but oftentimes I think we don't quite realize it because in market-based exchanges, there's what's called substitutability, so if the, store down the street from me closes down, there's a store, on the other street that I can go to. So you don't necessarily acknowledge or realize just how interdependent we are. With our scale, we found that there seem to be two sort of clusters of ways that people are looking at interdependence or perceiving interdependence. One is sort of this emotional, empathetic engagement, and the other is this shared fate. And so these are, they sort of load together, and we're starting to see that they may be predicting different things as well. Okay, so let's talk about a few more of the societies here really briefly, and then I'll show you our data that we've collected from the time of COVID. So one of the societies that we study is a group in Fiji, on the island of Yasawa Irara, and they often have these destructive weather events. And they also have this norm of helping, keri-keri. It's a norm to help each other in times of need, and this can involve, small daily things, or it can involve more major needs. And with keri-keri, individuals help each other in the same village, and keri-keri is actually based on village identity primarily. So anybody in your village, you can keri-keri for anything else. But sometimes when villages are hit by these destructive weather conditions, everybody in the village is in need at the same time. And so what happens then is that villages will have relationships with other villages where they can then ask the other village for help. And these relationships among villages are considered very sort of sacred, special things. There's rituals around them. And this really seems to allow the scaling of this need-based transfer system based on the scale where the crises occur and therefore where the need is. So it's very exciting to see that, this society on a Pacific island or a set of Pacific islands has, figured out this way of creating greater resilience. Now, you might be wondering, well, are these need-based transfer systems only in small scale societies? Well, my graduate student, Jessica Ayers, has been looking at people's expectations about friendship. And what she finds is that helping in times of need is one of the most important things that people expect of their friends. And at the very, very bottom, this is like literally, this was the bottom of our list, that always pays me back when they owe me is all the way at the bottom of the list. So really this idea of helping in times of need as opposed to sort of expecting a financial transaction may be really central to how we think about friendship even in modern times. And in Western societies that are market integrated as opposed to small scale societies. So here's another group that we have looked at. These are ranchers in the Southwestern United States, in Arizona and New Mexico. And we were able to actually look at this question of how does the unpredictability affect expectations of repayment. We asked a number of questions, including having people rate certain kinds of work and certain kinds of needs on a scale from being very predictable to very unpredictable. And then we also asked how likely they were to expect to get paid back for help. And what we found was essentially that as these types of needs became more predictable, people expected that they would get repaid for those things that were more predictable and didn't expect to get repaid for those things that were less predictable. So for example, illness, injury, and death, if those things occurred on a ranch and people came to help, they did not expect that they would get repaid for that. And this is work that's done by my graduate student, Diego Guevara Beltran, and also Lee Cronk, who's the co-director of the Human Generosity Project. So this is, I think, very exciting because it suggests that, we might actually have these systems, this psychology of need-based transfers that could offer more resilience during crises. And we just need to figure out how to best leverage that so that we can better support one another through difficult times. We've done some studies in the lab as well. And in those studies, we've found that with just a simple framing where we have people read about the Osotois system, that they actually cooperate more. So we find they give more, they make larger requests also when they're in need. They give unconditionally, they ask unconditionally, and they don't match as much the amounts that are given and received. So this is promising in that, it suggests, well, really just by kind of creating, making it known what these systems are like, giving this cultural information, you can actually elicit this need-based transfer behavior. Okay, our final society before we look at COVID. So the IC in Uganda, there was a very famous book written about them by an anthropologist named Colin Turnbull, where he essentially said that they were the worst people on earth. He called them the loveless people. And this was a really influential book. It was cited in many other books and sort of used as an example of how human societies can be evil and loveless. Now, for some context, when Colin Turnbull was doing his work, there was a famine happening among the Ik. So they had been forcibly settled from what were originally very large ancestral hunting grounds where they would migrate seasonally to follow game. But they were then forcibly settled, and the government provided minimal assistance for them. And so there was a period of famine. Now, despite this occurring, they have these norms of helping, like this saying, Tomorrow Marang, which means it's good to share. And when Catherine Townsend, our postdoc on this project, went and did field work for more than a year with them, she was struck by how much sharing is a part of their culture. So if anybody was eating food and someone else walked by, they would invite others to sit down with them and eat. Now, she also talked with people extensively about this idea of the Kijawik forest spirits, and they essentially are these mystical beings that bring misfortune to people who don't share and reward people who are generous. And the Kijawik are a very important part of the culture for the Ik as well. And so what Catherine did was she wanted to see what affects willingness to help and give among the Ik, and do these cultural ideas of Tomorrow Marang and the Kijawik actually help support their cooperation. Because what Colin Turnbull had argued was that they had a culture of selfishness. So she had them play dictator games, which we designed so that there was a sort of standard game where basically people were given resources and said, to them, how much do you want to keep for yourself? How much do you want to give to somebody else? And there was a sort of standard framing, control framing, and then a need-based framing, where the person that they could give to is somebody who was in need, for example, old or hungry. And then we also had a condition where we essentially asked about what they know about the Kijawik and what they do. So there were these different conditions. And then we also combined the need-based and the Kijawik condition. So for a total of 4 conditions. And what we found was very, very high levels of giving, especially in the condition where there was a needy recipient and the Kijawik were brought up. So these, more than 40% of the resources were given to the other person in those conditions. And this is a breakdown of how many participants gave what percentages. And you can see that in the purple condition, there were a lot of people who gave much more than half as well. Now, if we look at this in comparison to other societies, we see that the level of cooperation overall is actually just slightly higher than a meta-analysis that was recently done, looking across societies. Statistically, they're indistinguishable, but the Ik are at least as cooperative, if not more cooperative, than the other small-scale societies that have been studied. So this suggests that the selfish behavior that Colin Turnbull found was not a cultural adaptation. It wasn't inherent to them, that it was instead a byproduct really of famine. And what Catherine found in her work also was that the Ik reported sharing more and helping each other more during difficult times. So really theirs is a culture of need-based helping. And I see this as a really inspiring case, actually, because their norms, their conventions of helping each other collapsed when they had a famine, because there was nothing to give. They couldn't help each other. But what we've seen with Catherine's work is that these norms of helping have completely recovered, within 50 years. So that suggests that, even in very, very difficult times, this desire that we have to help each other and be embedded in these communities of mutual aid is a very powerful part of human nature that can, fully recover even after very, very difficult circumstances. So Now I'm going to show you a little bit of what we've been doing with COVID and how the pandemic has shaped human generosity. And I'm also going to show you some ways that you can explore the data that we've been working with. So we're a group of interdisciplinary scholars that are looking at cooperation and changes in cooperation and interdependence across the pandemic. And we also like to be a little bit playful about talking about the apocalypse as a way of, you know, engaging broader audiences and, you know, these questions, right, of how do we survive in difficult times. And so we have an ongoing study now with over 30 countries, and we have a large research team that have been working together on this, including my graduate students, Jessica and Diego. This is a timeline of when we began collecting data. I'm going to show you the next few slides that have our data for those first 4 time periods. And but we've been collecting data actually since then as well. So, but this gives you a sense of what was going on in these first several time periods. So our first round of data collection was actually before the pandemic was declared. We had a feeling that something was about to go down, so we rushed our IRB to try to get this study started. And here are the countries where we have data. So here is one of our measures of people's willingness to help in times of need. And you can see the questions at the very top. So here, you know, we asked people how likely they would be to let somebody move into their house for a week, where that person is someone from their neighborhood or a person who is a citizen that's not from their own country. And then in B, we were asking about whether people endorsed this idea that helping people in times of need is the right thing to do. And interestingly, what we saw was a small increase actually in people's willingness to let somebody move into their house who's a citizen not of their own country. But we also saw a slight decrease in people's endorsement of this idea that helping people when they're in need is the right thing to do. So already what we're seeing is that, you know, not all things about cooperation seem to go up together. Here are some of our measures for interdependence. And so here we asked, you know, when all of humanity succeeds, I feel good. How much do you agree with that? When my neighborhood succeeds, I feel good. And also this question of whether you rise and fall together with all of humanity or with your neighborhood. And we saw increases actually in people's reports of interdependence over these first time periods of the pandemic. Now, when we broke this down, though, by people with pre-existing medical conditions, what we saw is that a lot of this increase in feelings of interdependence was being driven by people who had pre-existing medical conditions. So that suggests that maybe there's something about kind of knowing that you're more vulnerable that then makes you perceive yourself as more interdependent with humanity when there is something like a pandemic going on. We're continuing our data collection now, looking at some questions also about mask wearing. And I'm going to show you some, so the data I just showed you, we have published in a preprint on SciArchive. This is all totally unpublished data. But before I go through that, I want to invite you all to go to this website, cooperationintheapocalypse.org. And I'm going to just show you how the interface looks, because you can actually analyze this data yourself. I'm going to share here. So if you go to cooperationintheapocalypse.org, there's a tab here that says data, and you can actually go here and see how these factors have been changing over the course of many months. And you can look at the overall patterns here. You can also look at the breakdown by age, by sex, by pre-existing conditions for all of these different factors. So this is an interactive app that is within our website. So, so that's all available if you want to explore it. And I'll show you some of our early findings now with mask wearing. So here, this is some unpublished data looking at people's willingness or how often people were reporting wearing a mask or staying 6 feet away from others. And we see that actually people who are feeling more stress related to COVID are wearing masks more, and people who think they're more likely to be become infected with COVID are wearing masks more. Those aren't so surprising, but this is the first data of its kind. And maybe a little bit more troubling is that we found that the number of in-person interactions people have had with others is actually negatively related to their likelihood of wearing masks. So essentially, this means that some people are having fewer interactions with others, and they're more likely to wear a mask and social distance. But then there's other people who are having more interactions and being less likely to wear a mask. So it's not like, people who are having more interactions are then being more careful about mask wearing. So this suggests that, there may be some important differences here that we need to look at in greater depth in terms of how these different tendencies are sort of clustering and grouping. This is a grouping that we've done of different activities that people engage in based on how much they reported being likely to wear a mask while doing them, and also them reporting whether they did these activities or not. So what we have is sort of these two main groups. The red box is sort of more essential kinds of activities, and the green box is things that are maybe less essential, more recreational activities. So, what we're seeing are these sort of patterns, and then we can use these patterns to then dig a little bit deeper in terms of, if there are differences in people's mask wearing behavior for required, more essential activities versus recreational activities. And this is a really fascinating graph I wanted to share with you. I think this is going to be the final one, where we, at the time point where you see that black line, we asked people how likely others were to be wearing masks in the supermarket. And then we split them into two groups, basically the high mask wearing and the low mask wearing communities. And then we were able to look at, well, how do these communities where there's more and less mask wearing, what happened to the incidence of COVID over time? What happened to the daily death rate over time? And then what happened to the deaths over cases? So this is essentially, how likely people are to die relative to the number of cases that are being reported. And, what we're finding is, suggesting that in areas where there is less community mask wearing, there is a higher ratio of deaths to cases. Now, that could be because there's, less testing. So people, who are only having more severe disease are being tested, or there could be other deeper reasons for this. And we're actually doing a follow-up study, thanks to funding from IMHR, where we're going to be able to look at just a US cohort and dig a little bit deeper into these issues with mask wearing. And this is my wonderful lab, and I'm really appreciative to all of them. And also this is, like I said, a much bigger project as well, with many different individuals from different institutions who have been helping with this work. So I want to thank all of them, thank all of our sources of funding, and also thank all of you for your time and attention. And Keith and Mitzi, thank you so much for having me on this webinar. It's been really fun to get to share my work with you all.
Thank you, Athena, very much. We're going to have a couple of minutes for questions. I can see that we have one question up. Before I go to that one, Athena, I wonder if I could just ask you one real quick.
Please.
Okay. And this is about your thoughts around how cooperation, especially in these times of crisis, is important for an individual's well-being, right? Both the community well-being and individual well-being. Okay. Yes. Because it seems to me that in a lot of ways, those of us who want to be good citizens and cooperate to reduce right, the pandemic, right, to reduce the amount of disease that there is out there, want to wear masks, want to socially distance, want to do all these things, right, and get really frustrated and upset and anxious and nervous and depressed over people that don't, right? So could you talk about that just for a second?
You bet. Yeah, I mean, I think that this pandemic is it's making us think a little bit differently about, well, what is cooperation? What is pro-sociality, right? Because, we sort of think, well, pro-social means like being around people and doing nice things for them. Well, in a pandemic, actually, cooperation and pro-sociality has to manifest very differently. You have to actually distance yourself physically so that you don't put other people at risk. And you have to come up with new ways of kind of creating and supporting and cultivating those bonds that allow us all to be more resilient in difficult times. So I think it presents sort of new challenges that have not really been addressed directly in a lot of psychology and mental health work, just because, there hasn't been a major pandemic in 100 years. And most of the research and practice in this area is all, from the last 100 years. So it's, I think, a new opportunity. And we have to kind of shift our mindset a little bit to be able to really help to create a more resilient society in this changing time.
Thank you. We have one question that was submitted by one of our audience, and it was, why did you start your human generosity studies in places other than the US, like with the Maasai?
Yeah, so originally with the Human Generosity Project, we wanted to really understand the roots of helping. And my colleague and the co-director of the project, Lee Cronk, he's an anthropologist, and he had been studying the Maasai. He had done more than 20 years of field work with them. And he told me about this experience that he had when he first went there. He thought that they had a reciprocity system involved in payback. So he went and he did, some experiments and talked to them. And then he got his results, and he's like, this makes no sense. Like, this doesn't fit with reciprocity at all. And so he had to rethink his hypotheses really about what was going on. And that led him to see that, well, no, Osotwa is actually about helping in times of need. And that really was the seed for the Human Generosity Project, that very early work that he did. And we talked about that, and I created this model that allowed us to really look at the viability of the strategy more broadly. And then it kind of grew from there when we realized, oh, well, this is actually also happening in Fiji. Oh, and this is, happening in the United States as well. And so it really has been an organic process of growing. And now we are actually shifting our attention to the US more, because we feel like we've learned a lot from looking across lots of societies, and we feel like the US actually is in need now of like help with figuring out how do we, create these kinds of relationships that allow us to be more resilient. So so a lot of our work now, we're kind of digging back into the United States, our home, but a place that is in a challenging spot right now, compared to the rest of the world.
Yeah, thank you. We have probably time for just one more, right? And so we have a question from Diane Price that, what is the next big COVID-related question you would like to explore in the future?
Well, so this issue about mask wearing, I think, is really important. And so we're interested in, how do people's beliefs about the future, their perception, their time horizon, how are those factors influencing mask wearing? And also kind of breaking down motivations behind mask wearing. Are you doing it to protect yourself? Are you doing it to protect others? Are you doing it because it's the right thing to do in general? So those are all important questions that we're going to be digging into. And we're also looking at friendships during COVID and changes in friendships. And that ties in, of course, with these important issues with mental health and mental well-being. So these are all the, or this is the set of some exciting things that we're looking at in the future. And we have, these measures about perceived stress and anxiety as well. So we can look at how all of those things interact. So, I mean, to me, it's just amazing to have this rich data set with all these different variables that we can, try to untangle some of what has been changing over the course of the pandemic and what is going to continue to change in the future.
Great, thank you so much. Let me turn it back over to our board chair, Mitzi Krakow.
Right. Thank you, Keith, for great moderating, and Athena for the presentation and all your good work. I'm looking very forward to going on your website and playing around with it. I think that's fascinating, and thank you for that opportunity to be interactive. I also want to thank everybody here for being here. If you would like to join our mission to help fund mental health research, we would certainly invite you to do so, and we would be honored to have you reach out. Of course, as all nonprofits do, we need more funding to help us provide this needed research support and our educational activities, such as the one that we had today. We also welcome volunteers with special skills to serve on our committees, such as finance, development, marketing, and grant management. We know we are stronger together, so we also welcome corporate and nonprofit partnerships. And we need more people to advocate for more funding for mental health research. So please follow us on our social media, and we will even have a merch for research store coming soon. You can buy a t-shirt helping to fund us and advocate, so that's a real twofer. We also hope that you'll join us at our next COVID-19 mental health webinars with Dr. Lonnie Shioda on October 16th, talking about an emotional toolkit that we can all use. And on November 18th, Dr. Felipe Castro will talk about resilience and how we can address the pandemic with findings from his own research. All webinars are free, and we encourage you to share the information with others through your social media and personal contacts. And you can also find information about us at imhr.org and follow us again on all the various social media. We really thank you for being here. Be well, stay well.